Hi, I'm Loren Roosendaal, and in this episode of Transformed, we're going to be talking about learning solutions. And it's going to be quite a challenge covering the differing learning solutions that are out there all in one episode. But I want to give you some pointers and key insights that will help you when choosing how to deal with implementing a learning solution, implementing your learning plan with the tools and solutions that are out there. Now, we're all familiar with classroom learning. And certainly in the past episodes, I've talked about key learning principles which already show you a lot of the weaknesses of classroom learning. But still, it's an important means to convey information. Just keep in mind when you're dealing with classroom learning that you're dealing with a huge variety of students, a huge variety of people that are listening to your story that may not be at the same level, may not be able to interpret materials at the same difficulty level, may not have the same kind of attention span. So at least try to keep it in mind and do the best you can while using that method. I doubt I need to explain much about the ups and downs of classroom teaching, other than please let some air into that room, because as we talked about earlier, the CO2 levels go up when a lot of people get into a classroom, and within about 30 minutes, they can get so high that people are basically reduced in their capabilities in the same amount as having an 0.8 alcohol level in their blood, which is absolutely crazy. So please let some air in and let those poor people out every now and then. But it's more important, I think, to look at some of the other solutions that are out there that you're already acquainted with in some ways, or some maybe you've never used before yet. And the most obvious one is, of course, traditional e-learning. Now, most organizations already have some kind of LMS or e-learning system in place. And the thing that irks me most about lots of the traditional e-learning solutions is that they have sort of been shaped as what I would call the motorized carriage of learning. Now, in case you're not familiar with the motorized carriage, you're probably not, and that has some good reasons, because most of the people that were familiar with the motorized carriage, maybe didn't make it to this day, some of which due to some gruesome accidents. But the concept of the motorized carriage is simply that when we get access to a new piece of technology, we usually look at our society around us and see, well, how can we implement that technology into what we're doing already? And what happens is we find the most simple and obvious solution that is not always right. So back when the combustion engine was first invented, people thought, wouldn't it be neat to have like a motorized vehicle which you could drive? And their first notion was to put an engine block into a carriage. And of course, a carriage had a seat for the driver up at the top of the carriage where he would normally keep the horses under control. So all they did is they put two handles at the top for him to steer the carriage, put an engine in the carriage, and off to the races they were. Now, obviously, this wasn't maybe necessarily the brightest idea, because whenever this carriage would come into contact with a solid object and come to a sudden halt, whoever was driving the carriage was launched 15 meters out into the street and probably did not survive. So, over time, we figured out maybe it would be better to put the driver on the inside of the carriage. Maybe it would be better if it wasn't a carriage at all. Maybe we should be thinking about building an automobile. And now e-learning very much started out as this kind of motorized carriage, and it's still sort of merrily going along its way as this rickety carriage, despite the fact that most of the principles it was founded on are just literally carbon copied from things we already had, learning systems that were hundreds of years old. Books and workbooks. Because essentially what happened when we started with e-learning was a very simple thing. We just took a page from the theory book, a page from the workbook, put them next to each other on a web page, and said, wow, now we have e-learning, we have electronic learning. And this kind of came as a shock to me, because I spent almost a decade, dealing with experience learning and training, and not getting the results we wanted, and seeing companies dealing with huge gaps in people's knowledge that when I finally got to the point where I started asking them, well, why did you never test people for this knowledge? And they said, well, we have an e-learning system. Of course, they all got an 8.9 for this bit of knowledge just a couple of weeks ago. And then when I asked them to show me how that happened, I suddenly saw it, and it was instantly clear. Because when you look at an e-learning system, the average e-learning system, the average e-learning course that you've built, well, what is it? It is a page of theory next to a page of questions. And I can just look at those and go like, oh, I see the theory. I know the answer to the question now. I can mark it, and I'm done with that page. And for me, that was just a realization moment where I was, oh, this is familiar. I got this in high school. I believe it's called comprehensive reading. So what you're really telling me is that for the last bunch of years, you've been testing all your people on comprehensive reading? And that's really what so much of e-learning has become. So just keep that in mind. If you're just doing that, you're basically testing comprehensive reading. And this is really the same no matter if you're using video or audio, because essentially that just elevates comprehensive reading to comprehensive listening or comprehensive watching. So it's very important to just be aware of that when you're dealing with e-learning, it can only do very little of what we would want to accomplish. You really need to look beyond just an e-learning solution if you want to make something that will actually stick with people and that will give you a reliable learning experience that will actually have credible results in future. Now, this is luckily where nowadays a lot of new solutions are coming in the sense that we've now got the first sort of intelligent learning platforms coming up, which thank goodness deal with this a lot differently. It's still a bit of a wild west out there. Most of these platforms aren't quite doing what they promise they do, but really good intelligent learning platforms are essentially capable of offering material not just at once, not just testing that material once and then saying, check, you got it. No, instead, we're now starting to see the introduction of systems that actually make consistent practice in recalling the information you're supposed to learn the core of the system. Systems that aren't feeding you needless theory, which you may already know, without first testing your knowledge, understanding what you know. Systems that are spreading the learning experience through repetition over a larger and larger time frame, repeating at the right times, dealing with motivation in the right way. So there are at least more and more learning platforms coming out into the world that are dealing with this better, that are providing this kind of intelligent learning system, which goes beyond just being what is essentially a digital version of a book. And so I think that currently is probably the most promising field of development when it comes to learning, is these intelligent platforms. Now, I probably hear you thinking, but what about VR? What about interactive training? I've heard these amazing things. I've seen this amazing stuff. I have a lot of in the field experience with all of these solutions, and the reality of it is actually quite interesting. When you look at something like VR, when you look at virtual training, those are amazing possible solutions for the future. They are amazing because they allow people to train and practice on skills that are built on knowledge that's already there. But the key word there is knowledge that's already there. Because the reality when you do get into this virtual training, and we've done virtual training with large corporates, with military, with government organizations for about a decade now. And anywhere we come in, we notice the same thing. We start out doing this amazing virtual training, this amazing virtual reality environment, and then it turns out that people actually screw up in the training scenarios, not because of stress or how realistic the scenario is, but because they actually don't know the basic fundamentals of what they're supposed to be doing. And that's one thing that I want to really warn you about, is there is this amazing field of new virtual training out there. But the reality is, if you start training people virtually and they don't have the core knowledge they need, you are going to make things worse rather than making things better. I liken this to a situation, if you like British comedy, you might have seen Fawlty Towers, right? Where John Cleese plays probably the world's worst hotel owner. And he's got this Spanish manservant, Manuel, who he's hired for the cheapest possible price, who doesn't speak a word of English. And I often liken training people virtually before they have the right knowledge to kind of how this guy was training Manuel in this series. You know, if he did something wrong, he got smacked. And if he did something right, well, there was no smacking. Now, what happens in that kind of situation is that actually based on the training people receive, they come up with the knowledge as they go. They come up with what they would have needed to learn on the go. And that may not always be the right knowledge. They may have gotten it completely wrong. So let's take this example scenario where let's say the delivery company comes in and it's delivering meat for the hotel, and Manuel goes out and he gets the meat and he gets a nice blue box of chicken and he puts that in the refrigerator and he puts it in the 7 degrees Celsius slot. And luckily, you know, the hotel manager sees this, gives him a smack, points to the 4 degree slot, and he moves it over. Now, after that, for a couple of months, everything is going great, right? The chicken arrives, it gets put into the right slot, and everyone's happy. Now, let's say the hotel owner is gone for a while, and then once again, the delivery company comes, delivers the meat, but this time the chicken is in a red box. So Manuel goes out, takes the red box, and happily shoves it into the 7 degree slot, because he had learned not that chicken needs to be in the 4 degree slot, but that it's actually the blue package that needs to go there. And so within a couple of weeks, everyone's got salmonella and the hotel is closed down. This is the fallacy of doing virtual training before people are ready with the knowledge. So please keep that in mind before you start going out and grabbing at all of these amazing shiny new technologies. Think about, do people actually have the core knowledge they need to get the job done? And how can I actually test that? How could I really make sure? How can I quiz them by surprise? How can I figure out if my assumption, which I probably got from some LMS system, which was really only testing comprehensive reading, if that assumption is actually true, or if people don't remember, don't know, and because of training, will end up with a significantly worse understanding of the world rather than a better one. So we've now looked at some of the core learning solutions that are available out on the market, at least, you know, in the broadest perspective. And in the next episode, I want to take you into how do you use that then to create the optimal learning experience. Which tools do you use? Where do you use them? How do you use them? What do you look out for? So, if you want to see all of that, join me in the next episode. And don't forget to like or subscribe and follow this channel.